Okay, ready, Diane?
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, it is my pleasure to extend a welcome to all of you to our first program of 2023. I am Diane Rosenfeld, president of the EHNTJC Sisterhood, and I wish each of you a happy, healthy, and safe New Year. A special welcome to Rabbi Neil Brief, our Rabbi Emeritus. We have an array of programs on a variety of topics planned for the next several months. I will mention just a few and hope you will consider joining us. Our program on February 1st will also be on Zoom only. It will feature Helene Herman, recently retired president of a 400-member lifelong learning club in Florida, and a lecturer for a number of university-led lifelong learning programs. Helene will present a program for us on the Jews of Cuba. March 23rd will bring us our annual Women's Seder, led by our Rebbitzin, Julie Weil. This will be both in person and on Zoom. In April, we will see a performance by actress Megan Wells, who will portray Meep, guys, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, a well-known righteous Gentile who was the protector of the Otto Frank family and others during the Holocaust. We will also celebrate Israel's Independence Day with a Yom HaAtzmaut program. Thank you to the following who made our program today possible. Our speaker, Leah Polin, Judy Arkin and Esther Javits, who both worked on the logistics for this program. Thank you to Debbie Rich for keeping track of our registrations and donations, and to both Debbie and Jeanette Ziegler, Executive Director of the Synagogue, for advertising this program. And a special thanks to both Cheryl and Larry Sklar, who are our Zoom experts today. I don't see Larry, but Cheryl can thank him for me. It is now my pleasure to introduce Cheryl Sklar, who will give a Devar Torah. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you. So this week we read Parsha Vayechi, and he lived. Much like the Parsha Chaya Sarah, which begins with the death of Sarah and not her life, this Parsha begins with Jacob's death and ends with the death of Joseph. Jacob, understanding that he will die soon, summons Joseph and blesses his children, and then blesses Joseph. Jacob then summons his other sons to make final predictions about their futures. Much of this text reads like a series of curses. After Jacob dies, his sons are concerned that Joseph may still hold a grudge against them. Now that their father is gone, might Joseph now seek to punish them for what they have done to him years before? Was it only Jacob's presence that prevented Joseph from taking revenge? The brothers demonstrate that they have not grown over the years, as they assume that Joseph would want to hurt them. This lack of growth is also reflected in the negative predictions made by Jacob at his deathbed. While we don't know if the brothers have changed, we know that some of them took seriously amoral and violent actions. Reuben had sexual relations with one of Jacob's wives, and Shimon and Levi destroyed an entire town after the Dinah incident. In contrast, Joseph has stopped being the spoiled child and manipulative vizier to Pharaoh. Joseph assures his brothers that he does not bear a grudge against them. He states, "Have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." Many of the sisterhood programs explicitly provide the opportunity for growth through their educational content. Even the more social programs do this by enabling growth of friendships between sisterhood members. Today's program will provide the opportunity to learn about notable Ukrainian Jews who influenced our world. Given the checkered history of the Ukrainian Jewish community, much like Joseph's troubled relationships with his brothers, I'm particularly looking forward to attending this session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Esther Javits, Education VP of Sisterhood. Happy to introduce Leah Polin, that has a long career in Jewish education. We will mention today just main points. Leah Polin holds an MA in Education degree from Northwestern University and a teaching certificate from now Spertus Institute. She started as an elementary school teacher in Chicago Public Schools. Then she went to work at Don Schulman Institute for Jewish Learning, and finally being the executive director till 2005. Later, she embarked on a career of a lecturer, started at Open University program of Truman College, Rhodes Scholar Program, North Shore Senior Center, Oasis, JCC of Chicago, Wiseman Senior Center, Del Rey in Florida, and the JCC Palm Beach in Florida. She also had many positions in Hadassah, North Shore chapter, which she's now VP of Education, and also active in her congregations, Or Torah in our area, and Anshe Chesed in Florida. She's also an author, producer of several pieces. One of them is 350 Years of American Jewish Women. She was involved in creation of the first national organization for adult Jewish education, and then, of course, belongs to many education, Zionist, and cultural organizations. So today she's going to talk about Jews of Ukraine. And Leah, the floor is yours.
Leah, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Is that better now? Is that okay?
Yes, and then let me know when you want me to pull up the slides.
Okay, in a minute. Well, thank you, Esther. That was a little belabored and a lot of people here know me, but thank you anyway. All right, so the topic for today is notable Ukrainian Jews. You can put it on, notable Ukrainian Jews who influenced our world. And of course, there are many, 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 many. I just picked 12 at random, starting with somebody who was very influential at the beginning and some people whose names we know today. How many of us on the program today have some kinds of origins from our parents or grandparents in what we call the Ukraine? Oh, I thought it would be more than that. I thought almost everybody. But anyway, through the years, the borders have changed a lot, as you saw on the map that I sent. All right, Cheryl, we can start with the map.
Okay, let me.
She's gonna put on a map. Anyway, you'll see this is a map of the Ukraine today. You can see it's surrounded on all sides by countries we know, and through the years, it has changed and changed and changed. Now, before we go into the personalities that we're going to talk about today, starting with someone who was born in 1700 and ending with someone who's one of the 10 richest men in the world today, and he's still in his 40s, so you can think about that. But before we do that, I want to give you a very, very, very brief history of the Jews of the Ukraine. It goes back more than 1,000 years. Jewish communities have existed in the Ukraine since the late 19th century. And some of the most important Jewish, religious, cultural, Zionist movements we know all had their origin in Ukraine. The Jewish community in Ukraine, up until this recent war, and I don't know if it's changed, but up until the recent war, the Jewish community in Ukraine constituted the third largest in Europe, and today we're talking about the fifth largest in the world. At times it flourished, and at other times the Jewish people in Ukraine faced persecution and anti-Semitic discrimination. In the years 1917 to 1920, 20th century, the Ukrainian People's Republic declared Yiddish the official state language, along with Ukrainian and Russian. At that time, the Jewish National Union was created, and that community was granted an autonomous status. Yiddish was the language, one of the three languages spoken in Ukraine, and Yiddish even was printed on the Ukrainian coins, the money, in the period between 1917 and 1920. Before World War II, slightly less than one third of the entire population of Ukraine were Jews. They were the largest minority, but there are a number of subgroups within the Jewish community of Ukraine at that time. The Ashkenazi Jews, the Mountain Jews, the Bukharian Jews, the Crimean Karaites, the Krimchik Jews, and the Georgian Jews. Those were all different geographical areas in that broader area that we call the Ukraine, but they were all Jews. In the westernmost part of Ukraine, Jews were first mentioned in the records in 1030. Then, if you remember a little bit about your Jewish history, the Khmelnytsky riots came in 1648, and the Cossacks came and they murdered large numbers of Jews. It's estimated that at that time, up to 30,000 Jews were killed or taken captive, and 300 small, tiny Jewish communities in the Ukraine were decimated or destroyed. During the 1821 anti-Jewish riots in Odessa, 14 Jews were killed, and some people consider that the first pogrom that we know about. At the start of the 20th century, anti-Jewish pogroms continued to occur, leading, as we know, to large-scale emigration from Ukraine. When Ukraine was part of the Roman Empire, anti-Semitic attitudes were expressed in numerous blood libel cases between 1911 and 1913. And lastly, in 1915, the Russian government expelled the Jews who were still left. We have a very, very, very bad relationship with the Ukrainians. And we know what happened during World War II, and it was not always very, very pleasant. I'm not getting into politics, but just to mention one thing. I gave this talk the other day at the JCC down here, and there were some quite elderly people there. And two men came up to me afterwards. They met me in the hall, and they had tears in their eyes. And they said, "We live in America. We love America. We know we are supposed to be on the side of the Ukrainians and what's going on now with the Russians. But one man goes to tell me his entire family was killed by the Ukrainians. And the other gentleman told me a very similar story, that his family was entirely killed at Babi Yar. How could we be on the side of the Ukrainians?" So the current conflict has caused a lot of internal dissension among people who come from that part of the world.
I tried that, and it didn't work.
What happened?
This is the speaker. This is speaker.
Let me see if I can figure out who's talking.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah, I went through there. There's no.
Carol, it's Adrian Friedman.
Okay, Adrian Friedman. Okay,
All right.
She's muted now.
All right. So our relationship as Jews to the Ukraine is very, 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 very checkered. And of course, at the end, We will talk about the current president, who himself is Jewish. All right, next picture. So as I said, I had many choices to pick from. And I felt that the best way to do it was to start with some historical people and then go on to modern times. So the first person who some of us might remember from our Hebrew school days is the Baal Shem Tov. It stands for the master of the good name. And those of us, again, who might remember from Hebrew school, if you take the letters, put it together, it's called Besht. He is sometimes referred to in Jewish history as the Besht. Now, what's important about this is that a dream, a thought that he had in the middle of the 1700s became a reality. And we're going to conclude today with how his dream led to the contemporary movement of Chabad. It is all tied together from this single gentleman in the 1700s to today in the 21st century. So he was born poor. As a matter of fact, most Ukrainian Jews were born poor, but he was born to poor parents in Okup, and he was orphaned already as a child. He lived in Yaslovitz and worked as an elementary school teacher and a sheikhet. You all know what a sheikhet is, the ritual slaughterer. In his 20s, he moved with his wife to the Carpathian Mountains, and he lived in seclusion, just having visions and dreams and getting his livelihood as a lime digger from the ground. He began to fashion himself as a healer and a leader. He moved again to another city called Meziboj, and then people began to flock to him. Before his life ended, it is said that he had 10,000 followers. Now, 10,000 in those days without any communication, certainly without WhatsApp or without a phone to communicate, is a lot of people. He never created a systematic theology. He never stood for what we would call one of the branches of Judaism. And he presented his teachings just in little pithy aphorisms, usually in Yiddish. But he said, and this is what's important, the goal of religious life is just cleaving to God, get close to God, believe everything that God wants of us. And we don't need, I don't know if you can raise the picture a little bit, we don't need big synagogues. Everybody should have in their community a little shul, and that's where we pray. And by praying to God, it'll be better for the Jewish people. Keep that in mind, cleaving to God, every individual getting close to God, and having 10,000 followers, because in a little while, we're going to show where that led. Okay, next fellow is a guy whose name is Zev Jabotinsky. Again, those of us who were decent students in Hebrew school and members of youth movements remember. And in the picture on the upper right, that looks like there's a big menorah, I just took that picture when I was in Israel. I was up in the Golan with my granddaughter, and I saw a monument of Jabotinsky, and I took a picture. While there, by the way, interestingly enough, I saw a young kid from Chicago, 18, whose last name is Pupko. Some of you know Rabbi Pupko. It's his grandson. And he was going around with a shmati, wiping up the monuments. And I said to him, what are you doing here? This was way up north in the Golan. What are you doing here? And he said he had a break from school. The school he went to was up in this area. He got familiar with all the Jewish monuments there. And it's customary in Israel when a soldier dies from a certain neighborhood, a certain community, in that community, they put a monument. And this kid took it upon himself once a week to come to the area where he was living and literally with a rag make sure that all the monuments were nice and clean. So he cleaned the monument for me, even though you can't see what it says. But when I took the picture of the monument of Zev Jabotinsky, very influential person. And many of the movements that we know in Judaism today, like Hasidism, like Zionism, and so on, had their roots In this period of time, from the 1800s through the 20th century, their origin was from people in the Ukraine. This fellow, Zev Jabotinsky, was born in 1880 in Odessa, and he grew up completely assimilated, had no connection to being Jewish, very, 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 very secular. He became a journalist, and he began to travel through Europe and see what was going on. In 1903, the infamous Kishinev pogrom changed the course of his life. We all know about what a pogrom is and how awful it is for Jewish people. Over the 3 days of the rioting, which began on an Easter Sunday, hundreds of Jews in the Moldovan city of Kishinev were attacked or injured or killed. Their property was destroyed, and the Jews were cowered in fear as the murderous mob rampaged unchecked. Hundreds of Jewish women were violently assaulted, and it became clear to this totally assimilated Jew that Jews had no future in Europe. He was convinced that Jews needed a Jewish state to be secure, and he became, at that moment in time, from nothing to a very ardent Zionist. He helped found the Jewish Legion to help British forces during World War I. He worked tirelessly for a Jewish state, which we now call Israel. And then he was expelled from Israel in 1929 by the British authorities. Jabotinsky continued to advance the cause of Jewish liberation, founding the underground Irgun movement. That's the movement of Menachem Begin. We know about that. And he said there is an absolute need for Jewish people to have a Jewish home. He did not see it as a religious place. As I said, he wasn't religious, but he saw the need for a Jewish home. All right, next. Very, very, very interesting. This gentleman, his name is Achad Ha'am. If you know Hebrew, that couldn't be his name, because Achad Ha'am means one of the people. Achad is one, and Ha'am is the people. So he adopted the pseudonym of Achad Ha'am, which means one of the people. By the way, his original name, for anybody who cares, was Asher Ginsburg, and he was born in 1856 in a little town near Kiev in the Ukraine. He died in 1927. He became a Zionist leader who believed in Hebrew culture. The culture of the Jews had an important place in the role of the future settlement in Palestine. He was reared in a very, very rigidly Orthodox Jewish family. He mastered all the rabbinic literature, the Talmud, the Shas, and so on. And suddenly he became attracted to a rationalist school of medieval philosophy and to the writings of the Haskalah movement. Haskalah meant the Enlightenment, people who felt that there was other ways of looking at life, but through the Jewish origins and the Jewish text. He became very involved in liberal Jewish thought, and he came up with the idea that it's time to integrate Judaism, as he learned it as an Orthodox Jew, with modern Western thought. A tremendous thinking change at that moment in time. At 22, he went to Odessa, which was the center of a movement called Chibat Zion, the Lovers of Zion. And there he was influenced in the Jewish nation, to be a Jewish nation. And, but it had to be very, very, very Jewish. He realized that there had to be a connection between the traditions of Jewish people, Jewish culture, and Jewish spirituality. His first essay that he wrote was called Lo Zeh Haderech. This is not the way, which emphasized that only Orthodox religion is not the way to have a homeland in Israel. So I mentioned again that Ukraine was like a breeding ground for great, great, great Jewish intellectuals who had different views of how Israel should be. And if you look at the quote here, we are used to thinking of the Arabs as primitive men of the desert, as a donkey-like nation. that neither sees nor understands what is going around. But this is a very, very great error, a great error. The Arab, like all the sons of Shem, like in Shem, Ham, and Yafet, the children of Noah, should have a sharp and crafty mind. Should a time come when the life of our people in Palestine imposes to a smaller or greater extent on these natives, they will not easily step aside. He predicted exactly what was going to happen if the Jews go into a state where they should be, where there are Arabs. Don't consider them nothing. They too have an origin and a background and a history. Next. Somebody you know, very interesting man. His name is Shalom Aleichem. And again, you probably can think that Shalom Aleichem isn't his real name. His real name was Shalom Rabinowitz. Shalom Aleichem means peace be unto you, good luck to you, peace be unto you. And I don't think too many parents would have named their kids that, but he became Shalom Aleichem from his writings. Actually, he became Shalom Aleichem because he wanted to hide his writings from people who he knew or his parents. Anyway, he was born in a town called Perezislav in the Ukraine, and he moved as a young child to Voronikov, a very small town, which later served as the basis for all the ideas he put forward for Kasrilivka, which, if you remember, was the town in Fiddler on the Roof. Anyway, he received his early education in a cheder. His father was wealthy, very unusual at the time. We think of most Jews in that part of the world as being the underdog and being poor. His father was a very, very wealthy merchant, and he was interested in the Enlightenment movement and in modern Hebrew literature. The father had a failed business and business opportunity. It didn't work the way he wanted. Poverty followed. 1872, Shalom Rabinowitz lost his mother. And in 1873, as a young kid at the age of 14, he entered the gymnasium. Gymnasium, when you see it in writing, might look to some of us like gymnasium, but it's pronounced gymnasium. And I think it is, in asking people, I think the gymnasium would be like we would call in Chicago or a magnet school. It was a school, but it was for smarter kids or special kids. It wasn't just the neighborhood high school. Anyway, he began writing in Hebrew, and the first thing he wrote was a dictionary in Hebrew of all the Hebrew curses he could ever think of, which was very, very humorous. Anyway, he began to write for different publications and get a little bit well known. In 1883, he married a woman named Olga, and he decided to write in Yiddish, not in Hebrew. He switched from the original Hebrew. Now he is writing in Yiddish, and one paper in Yiddish published one of his first writings in a pseudonym, and they said Shalom Aleichem. And that's how it stuck. That's where he got the name Shalom Aleichem. He was also happy to conceal his writings in Yiddish from his parents because they were trying to encourage him, his father tried to encourage him to write in Hebrew. So anyway, he wrote stories and sketches and reviews and plays and so on. And he began to write not only in Yiddish, but in Hebrew and in Russian. Anyway, by 1888, the family's financial situation got a little bit better. And he began to found a Yiddish literary annual magazine in which the standards to put something in there would be very, very, very high. Anyway, again, same history for a lot of people. The pogroms came in 1905, and he decided to emigrate to the United States. And for him, Shalom Rabinowitz or Shalom Aleichem, this became a period of great wandering around, like we would say a person trying to find himself. Anyway, in 1910, his son-in-law was a Hebrew writer. His name was Berkowitz, Yudi Berkowitz, And he began to take some of Shalom Aleichem's original writing in Yiddish and translate it into Russian, English, and Hebrew. And pretty soon he became very, very, very well known in the immigrant world of the Jews who were coming to New York. The dramatic version of Tevye's Daughters is what became Fiddler on the Roof. And we know that Fiddler on the Roof, I don't know if it still has that distinction, but has the distinction of being the longest run show on Broadway. And also Fiddler on the Roof, although it is so uniquely Jewish with all the ideologies and all the language, Fiddler on the Roof has been produced in more languages in more countries than any other play, any other production in the world. All right, now we'll start heading towards modern times and getting into some names that you will know, not necessarily theorists or historians or thinkers, but other people. And of course, Golda Meir, everyone knows, and she had a very, very, very interesting life. She was born in Kiev, 1898, and the family came to America in 1906, where they settled in Milwaukee. Just to digress a minute from about Kiev, my father always told us that he came from Kiev, came to America at 3 with his family, but he was born in Kiev. Many years later, my husband Stan, who many of you knew, was taking care of a lot of the Soviet Jewish patients who had come to Chicago during the big wave of Soviet Jewish immigration in the 70s and 80s. And he had a patient one day, Russian, and he said, "Oh, my father-in-law comes from Kiev." To which the patient said, "Dr. Polin, he could not have come from Kiev. No Jews lived in Kiev." And my husband said, "What do you mean?" That's what he told his wife, his children, my wife, and we all knew he came from Kiev. So this patient insisted that no Jews ever lived in Kiev. And the connection was made, like if you ask me where I come from, I will say Chicago, but I really lived in Skokie. People don't know Skokie. So you say the nearest big city. And Jews would say they came from Kiev, but they came from all the little towns around there. So comes the weekend, it's Shabbat, we're sitting at the Shabbat table, and my husband is relating the story to my mother, who, as some of you know, she was your Hebrew teacher, somewhat of a scholar. And she said, I know where Daddy came from. So Stan said, "Where?" So she said, "You know, the name wasn't Goldstein. That's not your maiden name. The name was Gostomelsky. He came from a town called Gostomel, which was like a teeny tiny section or suburb or neighborhood of Kiev." And my mother then went on to say that when they came to America, to Ellis Island, the family's name was Gostomelsky. And shortly after they arrived here, because no names were changed at Ellis Island, in the Jewish community, people said, "You can't go through life with a name like Gostomelsky," and the name became Goldstein. So I learned from that, when these Jews say they come from Kiev, maybe it wasn't exactly Kiev, it was one of the Stetlacher smaller communities around Kiev. Anyway, she went to high school. We're back to Golda Meir now. She went to high school in Milwaukee and became active in a Zionist youth movement, like many of us also did when we were growing up. And she emigrated to what was then the British Mandate of Palestine in 1921 with a husband. She had married a man along the way named Morris Meyerson, and they settled in a small kibbutz. Anyway, from there on, she became involved in one political movement, one political opportunity after another. And in 1948, David Ben-Gurion appointed her to be a member of the provisional government. And just a few days before the declaration of the independence, Ben-Gurion disguised her as an Arab woman and said, "You gotta go talk to King Abdullah of Jordan and tell him not to attack us." and which she did. She never revealed her identity, went in as a poor Arab woman begging with him not to attack the new Jewish state coming up. But of course, Abdullah didn't listen, and we know what happened after that. Anyway, she became very, very, very involved in the government. She was ambassador to the Soviet Union. And we all know that one of the beginnings of the Soviet Jewry movement was when Golda spoke there, and Jews just came out of the woodwork to come and hear Golda speak. She went up and up and up the political ladder in Israel, and eventually became the first woman prime minister. At that time, she was the third woman in the world ever to be a prime minister. The other ones being Indira Gandhi of India and Bandaranike from Sri Lanka. There were three women at the time who were heads of government. Anyway, Golda Meir went on to serve, and she was the prime minister during the time of the infamous war, Yom Kippur War of 1973. And that really was very, very bad for her. That's when she said, peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. Anyway, she resigned, and that was really the very end of her political career. She was also, by the way, a very, very, very great fundraiser. And when she came to New York, Chicago, different places, early on in her career, she was very, very, very successful in raising money. Just one more thing about Golda Meir, which I find fascinating. I've been involved for a long time in a lot of women's issues and so on. Not exactly a feminist, but Golda Meir is very, very disliked, very much so, by people like Letty Colton Pogrebin. Bella Abzug hated her. A lot of people, they felt that she did everything she could as a woman for Golda Meir. She never never used herself as a role model for other Jewish women. And as Letty Colton Pogrebin wrote once, she would climb the ladder and then pull the ladder out from under her so no other Jewish woman could have the opportunity to break the glass ceiling also. I don't know if I agree or not, but she is not by any standards considered a feminist. And as a matter of fact, Ben-Gurion referred to her as all the men in my cabinet without ever making the distinction that he did have a woman in the cabinet. All right, next. A name we all should know, Natan Sharansky. He is still living, he's in his 70s. You can read for yourself some of the quotes that he is known for. He is probably, of all the Soviet refuseniks of that period of time, around the 70s and so on, probably the most famous, the most acknowledged. And he became fluent and knowledgeable about what was going on when he was the interpreter to the first Soviet dissident, Andrei Sakharov. Anyway, he explored his Jewish identity, Sharansky, and found himself as the spokesperson for the growing Soviet Jewry movement. He became a refusenik, meaning one of those who was begging to get out of Israel, but didn't quite make it. In 1973, when his application to emigrate was denied, and he was arrested of all sorts of trumped up silly charges in 1977. He was sentenced to 13 years in Siberia. He coped with the imprisonment by focusing on his Jewish life. It was at that time in prison that he became very, very knowledgeable about Jewish history, Jewish identity in all of its forms. He was finally allowed to emigrate in 1986. I should say that during the time he was in prison, he was married to Avital, and she came to meet heads of state, came to America, as a matter of fact, stayed at my brother's house on a couple of trips, and became a spokesman for representing her husband, who was in the Gulag. Anyway, after he got out of the Soviet system, he came to Israel in 1986, and he has served in many, many, many capacities in Israel as a writer, as an editor, as a member of the Knesset, and chairman of the Jewish Agency for almost 10 years, and so on. A very, very singular, important person in the Soviet Jewry movement, which allowed more than 1 million people to leave the Soviet Union and get to Israel in the 70s and 80s. Next. All right, now we're going to switch gears and talk about some people from various areas of endeavor that their roots are in the Ukraine, but they went on to do something as a Jew that really was remarkable. And the first person is Selman Waxman. From the moment he is born to the moment he dies, man is subject to the activities of numerous microbes. What did Selman Waxman create that gave him the Nobel Prize? Anybody know? Antibiotics. He is the father of antibiotics. He was born in 1888 in a little town called Puluki in the Ukraine. Again, he matriculated at the gymnasium in Odessa, and they came to the United States. And in 1915, he got his degree, Bachelor of Science degree, in agriculture, never became an MD. He was in agriculture or microbiology. Anyway, he went on to get a master's degree. He went off to California and got his PhD in biochemistry in 1918. And he came back to Rutgers, where he became a full professor of microbiology and head of the Department of Microbiology. It was Selman Waxman who developed streptomycin in 1943, neomycin in 1948, and coined the term antibiotics. He got a Nobel Prize in 1952 for the discovery of streptomycin. And he is the father of the entire medical field of antibiotics, and he is a native of the Ukraine. Next. We all know that so many brilliant, outstanding violinists, pianists, cellists like Gregor Piatigorsky, so many Jewish musicians who achieved very, very, very high in their specific field of music came from the Ukraine. And so picking just one, I could have picked many, certainly in the world of violin, they all came from the Ukraine. But I picked Vladimir Horowitz, probably because he has an interesting life, a very, very, very interesting life that has some relativity to contemporary life today, aside from being a world-class pianist. Anyway, he was born in, again, Kiev, but the question is, was it Kiev itself or was it a little shtetl around Kiev? Anyway, some people say he was born in Berdichev. His birth certificate didn't show, but they say he was born in Berdichev, which would make more sense because Berdichev was a little town not far from Kiev. Anyway, very early on in life, he was born in 1903, and very early on in life, he showed musical talent, so much so that his father fudged his birth certificate, made him a couple of years younger so he wouldn't have to go into the military and possibly damage his precious fingers. Anyway, he went on to become a very, 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 very great musician, always uncomfortable with his own being, always suffering from some forms of mental illness. We'll talk about what specifically in a minute. Anyway, Toscanini enamored him and was very anxious to be the conductor when he performed, when Vladimir Horowitz performed, and Toscanini introduced him to his daughter. So Vladimir Horowitz was married to the daughter of the great conductor Toscanini. After he got very, very famous, frequently he wouldn't show up. Frequently he would freeze during a concert, and he had many, many forms of mental health medication and sessions and so on to figure out what was wrong. Turns out, apparently, that he was homosexual in the days when it wasn't popular or correct to come out as such, and that was what was troubling him. As a matter of fact, when he already got very, very famous, someone asked him about who are the great pianists in the world, thinking he would name himself. And Horowitz's answer, and I quote, "There are only 3 kinds of pianists in the world: Jewish pianists, homosexual pianists, and bad pianists." That's when it came out and the world realized that that was his problem, and one that he suffered from all his life, although he did go on to perform the music of the greatest composers of all times. All right, next, just a few more from totally different fields. Here's a fellow named Morris Lapidus. I don't know if anybody ever heard of him, but if you look at the picture, you see the Fontainebleau Hotel, and it was Morris Lapidus who was the architect of the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida. He lived a long life. He was born in 1902, very interesting life, and died in 2001. He was born in Odessa and came to America early on and received his degrees as an architect. Before 1950, he was given an order or a contract to build a hotel in Florida, namely the Fontainebleau. And he built it, as you can see, it's semicircular or whatever, it's a quarter of a circle. And inside it had a terrarium, and it had the longest staircase at the time, coming way, way, way down. If you remember the early pictures of the advertisements for the Fontainebleau when we were kids, they would show Marilyn Monroe on the staircase, sometimes followed by a gentleman named John Kennedy. But anyway, the Fontainebleau was considered very flamboyant and very, very, very different. The people who commissioned him were very happy, and he went on to build the Eden Rock, the Americana, and many, many, many hotels like that in Florida. Then he went on to build many of what we call the grand hotels in Las Vegas. All the time that he was doing this, he was the laughing stock of his contemporaries. The other architects thought that this isn't what a great architect should be doing. And he was always ridiculed and criticized by other people. So much so that when he was 80, he hired a truck and emptied out all of his carts of papers and plans and architectural drawings that he ever had, and he thought he was a failure. Well, it didn't take long thereafter where he was honored by the Society of Architectural Historians, and he was named an American original by the Smithsonian Institute's Copper Hewitt Design Museum, and he didn't have one paper or one architectural drawing left to prove it. He was not recognized by his fellow architects, but indeed, he felt that form follows function, and function could be having fun. Glamour is a function. So that is a great architect who designed many great buildings in America, but he was the laughing stock of people in his time. All right, next. Everybody know this name, Simon Wiesenthal. I imagine most of you read The Sunflower at one time or another. And he writes, "The only value of nearly 5 decades of my work is a warning to the murderers of tomorrow, you will never rest. Discovering witnesses is just as important as catching the criminals. Simon Wiesenthal, the most famous Nazi hunter of all time, was born in 1908 in a little town called Buchrach in Ukraine. And he was, during his life, imprisoned in 5 different concentration camps. And when he survived and came out, he dedicated his life as a young, bone-thin survivor in bringing the Nazi criminals to justice and educating future generations about the horrors of what he went to. His work led to the arrest in 1963 of a certain gentleman named Karl Silberhauer, and he was the one who they say is responsible for the arrest of Anne Frank and her family. Not that that is more important than other things, but Anne Frank became, because she wrote this book and we all read the book when we were young people, Anne Frank became like the logo or the symbol of all the survivors. Anyway, Simon Wiesenthal spent his whole life going after Nazi criminals, and in 1977, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles was built to carry forward his vision and to teach about the Holocaust, research the Holocaust, and they've been building, I don't know if it's finished yet, it seems like it's been building forever, a similar office or building in Jerusalem. Next. Jan Kuhn. You can see that Jan Kuhn was born in, I think, when was he born? He's only in his 40s now. He's only in his 40s. He was born in 1976, again in Kiev. He states as his birth Kiev. And he is now one of the wealthiest men in the world. I never heard of him until I was looking through the Wall Street Journal one day, and I love to look through the mansion section where they talk about the people who buy very wealthy, very big homes. And the headline said, WhatsApp's John Kuhn buys another big Los Angeles property for $87 million next to another one that he owns of similar value. And I said, who in the world is this Jan Kuhn, who he can afford 2 major houses on Malibu on the Pacific Ocean? Anyway, his story, he's still alive. He recently gave $100 million to Israel for something that holds an interest to him. His story is really reflective of so many of the Ukrainian Jewish people that I spoke about and that I didn't speak about. He was born in February of 1976 in Kiev, and to Jewish parents, he was an only child. They were very, 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 very poor. They lived in a very, very, very small town. And finally, the family, he and his mother and his grandmother said that they were going to leave. The father wanted to go with them, but they were too poor to afford a ticket for the father. He was left behind. The father died in 1997, never experiencing the success of his son. He was 16 when he came to America and had to learn a new language and everything that a young kid has to learn in America. He began to work as a sweeper, a floor sweeper in a grocery store. And he got a job for his mother doing the same thing. And they were sweepers in stores to put 2 pennies together to make enough for him and his mother and his grandmother to survive. He became interested in computer programming while he was in high school, and he realized that he had a gift for it, a knack for it. And by the time he was out of high school at 18, he was a very skilled, self-taught computer network engineer. He went to San Jose State University. He took up a job with a company called Ernst & Young, and on the job, he was assigned to a company called Yahoo, and he went to work on Yahoo on their security system. Anyway, while at Yahoo, he met another young fella named Brian Acton, and they became very, 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 very friendly. And they took a year off and they began to travel and think together. And it was Jan Koum who said, all of the applications on computer that allow people to communicate eventually have advertisements and cost you money. I'm going to create a communication device that will never charge people anything. And he went on to create WhatsApp, the application we all know, especially those of us who have kids in Israel. We can call there anytime because it is free. He launched it in 2010. It kept crashing at the beginning, and he faced a lot of challenges, and he just about gave up. His friend and partner, Brian Acton, said, let's keep going and see what we can do. And they finally perfected WhatsApp by February of 2013. It grabbed the attention of the social media giant Facebook. They paid $19 million for it in 2014. And the rest, like they say, is history. Jan Koum now is one of the wealthiest men in the world. And WhatsApp is used by so many people, especially, like I say, those of us who have children in Israel or any place, because you can talk wherever, whenever you want, and it doesn't cost you anything. And now to the end, the last one, Menachem Schneerson, the Rebbe. This is not promotion. I am not promoting Chabad. That's not my intention. What I want to do is relate Chabad today in 2023 to the vision the Baal Shem Tov had in the early part of the 1700s, because the Chabad today is the result of the vision of the Baal Shem Tov many years ago. The current Rebbe of the Chabad is Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Chabad people always have two names, the male and the female. Sarah, from a Sarah, Chaya Mushka, Menachem Mendel. I don't know why, but they always have a double name. Rabbi Schneerson was born in 1902 and died in 1994. And of course, he was born in the Ukraine. That's why I'm talking about him. He was very educated. He went on to the Sorbonne, has degrees from all over, and got married to Chaya Mushka, who was another distant relative, the Rebbe's daughter. They got married, he was 26. He then went to Berlin. His life was, he was trapped during the time of World War II. And then he became the Rebbe, I think in the 50s or 60s, sort of responsible for all the Chabad people all over the world. So where is Chabad today after this person's dream? Chabad has centers. This is the Lubavitch division of Chabad. There are a lot of Hasidic sects. When we talk Chabad, it refers to the original sect from the town of Lubav or Lubavitch. Anyway, they now have more than 1,500 institutions on virtually every country in the world on all 6 continents. And they say the data about Chabad is absolutely remarkable. And I'm going to read you some of the things that have happened. On November 19th, a month and a half ago, they had a big gathering in New York. They do it once a year, and they bring in the Chabad representatives, the Chabad Shlichim, they're called, Shluchim. They bring them in from all over the world, and they have a big banquet or a big festival. So on this day of November 19th, they brought them all the Shluchim from all over the world, and they had 6,500 Shluchim who were at this banquet, guesstimated to be the largest banquet ever held in New York City. Anyway, that day was the 120th anniversary of the original Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And for the gathering this year, they had 36 Torahs commissioned to be written last year to be ready for this year. And if you know anything about the commissioning of a Torah, it's very expensive. An average Torah to be built, to be written, costs anywhere from $70,000 on above. It has to be handwritten and so on. So for this gathering coming up on November 19th in 2022, they had 36 new Torahs commissioned, because at the end of the conference, new shlichim, 36 new ones, would be going to 36 different cities or countries in the world. And this is where we stand today with Chabad. There are 5,646 couples, all 50 states, and more than 100 countries in the world have a Chabad Shaliach and his wife and family. In 2022, 120 new Chabad centers were established. They are on 500 campuses all over the world. There's 200 new young professional centers that they're starting in the world. And like I say, in virtually every country where there is a Jew, there is a Chabad. They operate teen centers. And according to the most recent Pew study of Jewish people's behaviors, 2 out of 5 Jews in the world have been touched at some time by Chabad. That means eating there for a meal when you're traveling. That means going to a public festival and having a guy come up to you and say, do you want to put on tefillin? It means many, many, many things. Since the beginning of the 21st century, Chabad in America alone has grown by 200%. And they are now singularly the largest single movement in, whether you like it or not, and this is not a promotion for it, whether you like it or not, it is the largest, if you call it a movement, of Jews around the world. But as I say, Chabad is just the Babich or other kind of Hasidic sects that along the way from the dream of the Besht in the 1700s till today broke off and have their sect in around the world. And lastly, because this always comes up, a little bit about the Jewishness of the current president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. We know that he's a politician. He's the 6th president of the Ukraine since in the recent years. He was born to a Ukrainian Jewish family. He grew up as a Russian speaker. That was his native language. He lived in the town that I can never pronounce, Dnipropetrovsk, some big, big city, but I can't ever pronounce it. Anyway, before he became an actor in the Ukraine, he got a law degree from the Kiev National Economic University. He then went into comedy and created a production company for television, films, and cartoons in the Ukraine. And he created a series called, in Ukraine, called The Servant of the People, in which he played the role in this comedy series of a Ukrainian president. The series aired between 2015 and 2019 and became the most popular television program ever in the Ukraine. And he announced his candidacy in 2019, in the last day of December of 2018, sort of as a joke. And when the election finally came, he won by a tremendous amount of votes. I don't have it right in front of me, something like 83% of all the votes, because he was a national figure. His program was sort of like we have Saturday Night Live. It was like a comedy cartoon on what was going on in the Ukraine. So he himself is Jewish through and through. His wife is not Jewish. He had his 2 children baptized, and there are Jewish people who are very, very, very troubled in America by the fact that we Jewish people so support the Ukraine government and Zelensky so much now. But that's a political statement and not part of today's talk. So I hope I introduced you to a dozen Jews who were born in the Ukraine and who did something special for the world that we all benefit from. That's it.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can bring back your face.
Fine, fine.
And
Do we have
I can actually
questions?
make you, this makes Esther the speaker, but anyway,
I'm sorry.
there you go.
I'm reading in the chat some very nice compliments. Okay. Thank you for your outstanding program, outstanding presentation. Leah, terrific presentation as usual. Great job, Leah. Thanks. Which is absolutely wonderful because it was an outstanding presentation and the PowerPoint really added to it. Are there any questions for Leah?
Nobody wants to share a story about their grandmother or grandfather or something who came from.
Susan, maybe if you can unmute.
Yes, sure. I just have a question for you, Leah. This was so fantastic, and being active in the community here, I really appreciate. My question is, are you in touch with or working with some of the Ukrainian people, either the museums or the Consul General here in Chicago is very active, very pro-Jewish, and I just wonder, you've really turned us on to a lot of great knowledge, and I wonder if you've had that opportunity yet. Thank you.
I have to be very honest. I was very, very involved, along with my brother, who was really involved nationally in the Soviet Jewry movement, in terms of marching, and even when my sons had their bar mitzvahs, we twinned with boys over there and so on. I have not gotten personally involved at all in the Ukrainian situation in America with the immigrants and so on. I've donated clothes and so on, but I have not gotten personally involved. And I will say at the beginning, knowing a little bit, I know Jewish history a little bit, I was very, very torn because I know that even though we hate the Germans and we hate the Russians for what they did to us, people who know Jewish history know that the Ukrainians were right up there with the worst of the worst of the worst. And I don't know if you have seen, I don't think I can put my finger on it right now, but there's a letter circulating. I just got it this week from a woman. I don't know her. She's not famous. And she's circulating a letter as an American Jew, telling us all details about horrible things that Ukraine did to Jewish people during World War II, detailing thing after, and it just tears your guts apart. And yet, like I said, I don't want to make this political, yet those are innocent people. Everybody, I think, hates Putin more than they hate the Ukrainians. And that's the reason we as Americans, most of us, are sort of, on the side here of the Ukrainians. But they were not good to the Jews. And in answer to your question, I am not personally involved in any organization. I mean, I give to Federation. Hadassah has a lot of Ukrainian, patients. And when I was in Israel, in fact, Judy Arkin knows this. And when I was in Israel in the fall, I visited youth Aliyah villages there, and they are taking in every week. Was it 18? I think I said, Judy, 8 new immigrant kids from the Ukrainian village. So in view of the fact that I'm very involved in Hadassah, I can say that I'm doing my role by letting them absorb the children into youth Aliyah. But on a personal level, I cannot say I've done anything out of the ordinary to help the Jews in, or the Jews who've emigrated from the Ukraine. Carol, I think.
Diane?
Well, I think Leah just called on Carol.
Okay, I wanted to ask, how are the Ukrainians doing in Israel right now? Are they, getting jobs and learning the language and realizing that they're really Jewish?
Yes, they're doing fine. However, in the current government that just was installed a week or two ago, there are some people who are trying to make it much harder for people without exactly, who are qualified. Somebody said who are qualified. And whereas in the previous wave of Russian immigration in the 70s and 80s, you had to prove that you were 1/8 Jewish. In other words, one grandparent is Jewish. Now, I don't know if it passed. I'm sorry, I don't know. Maybe somebody can tell. They were looking, the new government was looking to pass a rule that said, forget the grandparents. You had to prove that you were the child
of two Jewish parents.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they're trying to make it harder. Many of the Ukrainians at our time were not poor Jews. They were professionals. They were like all the rest of us in this audience. They had a job and so on, and it was taken away from them. So many of them have done fine in Israel. The question is, if things come to a settlement in Ukraine, got to be good, and things calm down, will these people stay in Israel, or will they go back to their life in Ukraine? And we don't know that. We don't know that. Israel's investing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and we don't know if they'll stay in Israel or go back. Maybe
I think they'll probably stay because there's not much left for them to go back to when you watch the news. I mean, there's so many parts of the country are just completely, practically leveled. And I don't know how they're ever going to rebuild it again. You know, it's going to take a bundle of money. So, you know, I feel bad for them. So if they're moving, like the Christians that moved to Poland and then they moved to other countries, they're going to start a life there and stay there. Really, that's what I think. But
I think you're right. The country is so destroyed.
It's so destroyed. I mean, Putin did a great job. I hate him worse than any Ukrainian. So, okay, that's all I want to say.
Okay, I know Fran Gibberts has her hand up, and Michelle Ressler had a question, and then I have a comment about Chabad on college campuses. Why don't we start with Fran Gibberts?
Leah, you never disappoint. It's always been phenomenal what you've done, and your knowledge is it's mind-boggling altogether. But when you're talking about Kiev, Max's family was from Kiev. That's what we learned through the years. But when you go to Waldheim and they have the arches from each forain that they belong to, his family is from the Pavlicher forain. So is that the part of Russia that they actually came from, was Pavlicher or something to that effect, of the town instead of Kiev, even though they all say they're from Kiev?
I know that the word Varane, which if you go to the Waldheim Cemetery, which unfortunately I've been to many times in my life, all the Varanes have their old cemetery. What the Varanes means, like my grandfather belonged to the Luknik Shul, and all that meant is when the Jews came from Eastern Europe, many from the Ukraine, they were comfortable with their own landsmen, with their own people from back home. They tried to settle in a similar neighborhood, so they established their own shul. And on the west side, you have, I don't know, the Lukniker shul and the Marienpol shul and the Zhytomyr shul, and I can't remember, because that meant that somebody who started it came from that shtetl, that geographical area, and other people joined in. I also know that the word gubernia, I learned this from my mother-in-law, the word gubernia, which is sometimes used, is what we would call in America like a county. I think she translated it for me like a county. So gubernia isn't a name of a place, it's like a county. And Varane, I think, and I'm not an expert in Yiddish, and I know Annette is and some other people, I don't know what Varane means, if it's a legal destination for land. I always thought it meant like a fraternity of people who came from that city. I don't know.
That's what I was told, that it was like the club that they all joined. The
yes. And they joined it because they had something in common from that city. Right. That's why they joined that forain. Yes, that's how I learned it.
That's how I learned it too. Thanks, Leah.
I'm going to read the question from Michelle. What's the situation for Jews today in the Ukraine?
I imagine as bad as everybody else. A lot of them are out. As I said at the beginning, it had the third largest Jewish population of any of the European countries. But a lot of them have gone to Israel. A lot of them have gone wherever they can go, to Canada. So I don't really know. I can't imagine it's good for anybody there if there's no power in the wintertime. Need I say more? I mean, I'm lucky I'm in Florida. I'm not complaining. But if you live in Chicago and there's no power, it's awful. It's awful. So I don't know. I know that many of the doctors, and I read this in Hadassah, many of the doctors who have come do go back to Ukraine. They work in Israel and they do go back to try to help people in the Ukraine. That I saw somewhere in one of the Hadassah promotional pieces. Life there is not good. It's not good. The question is between that and Russia, from the fire to the frying pan, what is better? I don't know.
I think Zelensky wants the men to stay. He let the women and children go, but many young men had to stay.
That was in the beginning, but I think now he almost wants people to leave because he can't keep on, you know, electricity and water and yeah.
Somebody just recommended a book, Servant of the People. Is that the book about the life of Shimon Peres?
It says it's on Netflix.
It's the movie. It's
wonderful. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
It's a comedy. But it's really way more than a comedy, and it's astonishing that it was made. I don't think you have something like that actually made in this country. It's a very high level satire, really, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see what this, you know, the country looked like before. But you can see when you watch it why 82% of the people voted for him. It's quite something to watch.
I'm going to read another comment that I see here from Marlene. It says, my grandfather on my dad's side emigrated from Kupel, Ukraine in the very early 1900s. A cousin who arrived in the USA in mid-90s has given us a lot of family information. There are distant cousins still in Ukraine or have sought temporary shelter in Greece and Moldavia. Toda, Leah, your choice of those to highlight was especially relevant and interesting. I just want to add one thing about Chabad on college campuses. It is amazing. I have grandchildren, you know, at different college campuses, and I have friends, their grandchildren are at some of these smaller colleges, etc. It is so phenomenal because you have Jewish children from secular backgrounds, from knowing really nothing, no Hebrew school, no Jewish experiences, etc. and so on. They are going to Chabad on Friday nights and they are absolutely loving it and they're learning a lot. And I mean, I saw the Ruach at a Chabad dinner at Carnegie Mellon last March when I was visiting my grandson, and his girlfriend is at University of South Carolina, and she became a very close friend of mine's granddaughter, and they sent me a picture. They were making challahs together. So it's really so much more, it seems, than Hillel. It used to be Hillel. One final little comment, okay. My ex-father-in-law, when he was asked where he was from, he said the name of a tiny town, and he always said it was near Kiev.
Really?
I don't remember the name of the town or anything, but I remember it was near Kiev.
Interesting.
Does anyone have any other comments, questions?
I have one question, Diane, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. And I don't know if Leah, if you know, or anybody does, but I'm curious because I don't know the origin. Why is the Rebbe called the Rebbe and not the Rabbi or the Rav? I don't know the origin of the word Rebbe. So do you or anybody know about that?
I think, and I'm not an expert, I know Rabbi is English, Rav is Hebrew, and I think Rebbe must be the Yiddish format for rabbi. I don't know. I can't really answer that. Some people who speak Yiddish, I don't speak Yiddish, but I think a Rebbe is like Yiddish for, we would say, a rabbi or the Rav in Hebrew. you refer to a rabbi piece as distinct person. I don't know, maybe Gloria Ann knows, or June knows, or Annette knows. I'm not exactly sure where that originated. By the way, since this guy died, Menachem Schneerson in '93, I think, they don't have a singular Rebbe now. They he acts as it, but there's a question in the Chabad movement as to who is the current Rebbe. Who is the current Rebbe now? This Rebbe doesn't have any children, and when he died, he left no children. He and his wife had no children, so there wasn't an ascension, shall we say, or descendant who inherited.
The Rebbe Schneerson
maybe Gloria
was the son-in-law of the former Rebbe. He had no children also. So he appointed Schneerson as his successor. But Schneerson never appointed anyone. So they still go to the grave to see him, and he never appointed any successor. So the movement, the Lubavitcher movement, actually doesn't have a Rebbe.
That's right.
My accountant has a big picture of Schneerson in his house.
Yes, because that's who they, that's the Rebbe. And even though he's gone, he's still
the Rebbe
because he never appointed anyone. Really? Right. And Rebbe, I wanted to say, is Yiddish, because that, if you know the song, the Rebbe Eli Melech is governing, the Freilich, you know, so that's what it is. The Rebbe is a Yiddish term for a rabbi.
The word Rabbi in Hebrew means Rav Sheli, my rabbi.
Yeah, but that's not it. The Rebbe is the Yiddish for rabbi.
So it was always in the family, if I'm understanding you right? It was like in Great Britain through the crown. Is that, I mean,
but it was his son-in-law.
Political. I'm asking.
Yeah, but he was the son-in-law. He wasn't a blood relative.
He married the daughter of the previous Rebbe. Right.
There is no requirement to have a blood relative.
No,
but it was traditional to appoint someone, and Schneerson did not appoint someone.
Not do that. Yeah. So he's still considered the Rebbe.
Wow.
I just think it's fantastic. I live down in Florida. I belong to a shul down here, but right down the street is the Chabad down here. And that rabbi, Chabad Rabbi Cement, from a big bunch of rabbis named Cement. There's Cement in Miami Beach, there's Cement in Boston. He came here and he talked to a rich man he knew up north, and he said, I want to build a shul down in Boynton Beach. And this man anyway, we now have a major Jewish community down here because somebody told that Rabbi Cement, that's the next place, go put up a shul and people will come. They're very, they do a lot of good work. They do a lot.
Yeah, the organization is still working, even there is no major rabbi.
Right.
Oh. Leah, just one thing, when you're talking about this with Schneerson and Gloria Ann, do you think he purposely did not appoint anyone before so that his name would be, perpetual? Gloria Ann smiling.
Interesting.
I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there, Gloria Ann and Leah.
Well, he died as a very old man. He had many opportunities to appoint.
Yeah.
Right.
Not really. He died of a stroke.
That's a good theory, as good as any other theory.
No. He died of he had a stroke, and he couldn't speak for some years before he died. So whether he would have is unknown, but
no, he didn't. He wasn't. He could have written it out.
Yeah. He could not speak.
One of you may know that the man who took care of him all his years, his cardiologist, was a Skokie fellow from my shul in Skokie. The lovely Ira Weiss was his personal cardiologist and flew to him on a moment's notice, plus every week on a regular basis. He was Rabbi Schneerson's personal cardiologist, and they had a very, very close relationship.
Yeah. So what'd he say?
Okay, it's sunny outside. I want to go sit by the pool for a little bit.
Oh, please. We're gonna kill her.
Chabad just opened up in Lake Forest, someone said.
Now
We don't even know if there are any Jews in Lake Forest.
That's really interesting.
Thank you so much, Leah.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah, Leah, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks Cheryl Sklar for coming to the rescue. My daughter tried to teach it to me last night. And I said, oy vey, I'm not going to know. And Cheryl came and it worked out fine. So thank you.
You're welcome. No problem. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you all for